They say every royal birth begins with celebration. Trumpets, cheers, prayers whispered to heaven, but not this time. Not in this room. The palace was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your chest feel heavy. Only one sound broke through thin, strangled, and weak. A newborn's cry. Not the loud, healthy wail of a strong baby, but something softer, strained, like it took everything in him just to breathe. The room was dim. Heavy curtains kept the morning light away. Candles lined the walls, flickering nervously, like they didn't want to see what had just arrived. The midwife stood frozen, hands trembling, her face pale. She looked down at the bundle she'd just unwrapped, and stepped back. Slowly, quietly, she let the cloth slip from her hands. It fluttered to the floor, forgotten. He had come into the world wearing a crown of silence, the boy born to rule, the boy whose name had already been written into prayers, whose throne had already been carved, whose blood was said to be divine. But no one in that room could speak. No one dared to say what they saw. His tiny mouth hung open, unable to close. His jaw stretched longer than it should have, and his eyes didn't seem to focus. The nursemaid crossed herself. The priest beside her lowered his gaze. They had spent generations protecting this bloodline, refusing to mix it, refusing to taint it, folding and folding the same names into each other until the tree bent in on itself. They called it purity. They called it tradition. But in this quiet, candlelit room with a baby struggling just to exist, the truth was harder to deny. The price of their purity had come due. The queen hadn't even seen her son yet. She was still breathing hard, somewhere behind the curtain, waiting to hear if her child had lived. And yes, he had. But no one wanted to carry him to her. Not yet, because no one knew how to tell a mother that her son, her heir, the future of an empire, was broken. He baby was eventually wrapped again, gently this time, as if softness could undo what had already been done. A servant was sent to inform the queen that her child had survived. Not a word more, just that he lived. That was enough for now. Behind the nursery doors, the whispers had already begun. The nursemaids avoided each other's eyes. The midwife asked to be excused. The priest lit another candle, though the flame did nothing to warm the air. For centuries, this family had clung to one idea tighter than any crown or kingdom blood must remain pure. Royal blood, they believed, was not just special. It was sacred, chosen by God, untouchable, and so they did everything to protect it. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. Brothers and sisters shared not just homes, but family trees twisted so tightly that names began to repeat. Faces did too. It was all for the sake of legacy, of lineage, of a divine order that placed them above the rest. But the truth no one dared say aloud was this. What they called purity was slowly poisoning them. Each generation looked more like the last, but also more tired, more fragile. Babies were born with weak lungs, misshapen bones, minds that could not hold thoughts. Some died before their first words. Others lived long enough to wear crowns, but not long enough to truly rule. And yet the cycle never stopped. To be royal was to be sacred, they whispered, as if it were scripture. Untouchable, unstainable, even if it meant marrying your niece. It wasn't love. It wasn't choice. It was duty. The kind that broke bodies, dimmed eyes, and left entire empires in the hands of children who could barely lift their heads. And now, as that frail cry echoed down the halls once more, the curse they had spent generations ignoring stood swaddled in silk. Small and helpless, but already marked by centuries of pride. The queen waited in her chambers, still pale from the birth, her hair damp against her cheeks. She had not yet seen her son, but she had done what was expected. She had given the kingdom an heir. That was her only purpose. She had been told. This since she was a child. Her name was Mariana of Austria, though the name hardly mattered. She could have been any girl in any palace, so long as her blood was right. She had been married off before her voice had even lost its softness, promised to a man more than twice her age, her own uncle. At 13, she wore silks heavy enough to crush her, a crown that didn't fit, and a smile she was told never to let fade. Love was never part of the arrangement. Affection wasn't necessary. What mattered was obedience and the ability to bear children. So she did, quietly, dutifully. Each time she was led back to her husband's bed, she closed her eyes and remembered nothing. She wasn't allowed to love, the servants whispered in the halls, only to breed. She prayed her child would be strong. She hoped he would be spared. But deep down, she already knew the palace had long stopped producing kings. It only birthed ghosts in royal clothes. And as she waited to meet her son, hands folded tightly in her lap, she braced herself not for joy, but for heartbreak. She was finally allowed to see him, her son, wrapped in layers of embroidered cloth, too small for the weight of the crown he would one day wear. Mariana held him close, but something in her arms felt wrong. Fragile, cold. He blinked slowly. His lips parted, his breathing faint and uneven. She kissed his forehead anyway, because that's what mothers do, even when their hearts are breaking. But the palace didn't care about broken hearts. It only cared that she had done her duty, and now they would wait for her to do it again. The queen's chambers became a place of silent war. Her bed no longer belonged to her. It was a battlefield, dressed in silk. Every night, she lay still beneath her husband's heavy hands, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to be over. No words were exchanged, no tenderness offered. Her body wasn't hers anymore. It was the kingdom's, a vessel, a tool, one that had to keep producing sons, healthy sons, strong sons. But each time, it became harder. Miscarriages came like storms, sudden and cruel. One child was born and died before sunrise. Another never moved at all, and still they asked her to keep trying. They lit candles in the chapel, whispered prayers behind doors, as if holiness could undo what centuries of inbreeding had caused. The palace walls soaked in every loss. Silent screams were swallowed by velvet curtains. And every morning, Mariana would rise again, pale and hollow, dressed in gold, and pretend nothing was wrong. Because a queen does not weep. A queen endures, even as her body breaks from the inside out. The days turned into months, and the palace held its breath as the infant prince grew, or at least tried to. He was named Charles, the heir to the Spanish throne. But from the beginning, something was wrong. He couldn't hold his head up. He cried constantly, or not at all. When he tried to feed, he choked more than he swallowed. Still, the royal painters were summoned, and portraits were made showing a healthy baby in gold-trimmed lace. They dressed him in velvet, but no amount of silk could hide the truth. Charles was broken from birth. His jaw didn't close properly. His tongue was too large for his mouth, always wet with drool. His limbs were soft, as if his bones had forgotten how to grow. He didn't walk. He barely spoke. And yet, no one dared say it aloud. Not to the queen, not to the king. The court continued with its ceremonies, bowing before a child who could not even hold a scepter. Behind closed doors, doctors came and went. Some blamed spirits, others blamed the stars. But the truth was carved into his face and body. It was the family's own blood that had betrayed him. Charles was the product of generations of closed circles, of uncles marrying nieces, of brothers taking sisters as wives. And now, the cost of that silence, of that pride, had a name and a crown. He was not just a sick child. He was the future of an empire, and he was crumbling before he could even stand. The court did everything it could to pretend nothing was wrong. They spoke in soft tones when Charles was carried into the room, his head lolling to the side, eyes unfocused. The servants bowed deeply, holding their breath as if respect could replace strength. When he tried to speak, the words came out jumbled, his tongue too heavy to shape them. The doctors continued to assure the queen that he would improve with age, but time only made the truth clearer. Charles didn't walk until he was nearly 5, and even then, only with help. His spine was weak, his body thin and twisted, his mind clouded. He drooled constantly, and when he laughed, it was often at nothing at all. Behind the velvet curtains, Courtiers exchanged glances they weren't supposed to. The people whispered outside the palace gates. A prince, born to rule an empire, could not rule his own hands. And still, no one dared admit what they already knew. His blood so carefully guarded, so obsessively preserved, was the very thing that had broken him. This was not bad luck. This was design. This was centuries of inbreeding, of stubborn pride, of believing that keeping bloodlines pure was more important than keeping children alive. And now, all of Spain watched as a boy, barely able to speak, was called their future king. Charles grew older, but his body never caught up. His jaw had stretched unnaturally long, jutting forward in a way that made it nearly impossible for him to chew. Eating became a struggle. Meals were cut into tiny pieces, softened into paste, sometimes spoon-fed to him like a child. His tongue hung heavy in his mouth, often slipping out when he wasn't paying attention. He drooled on royal robes sewn with gold thread. Sometimes, in the middle of ceremonies, his body would suddenly stiffen, his eyes rolling back seizures that no one dared name. They simply fanned him, whispered prayers, and continued as if nothing had happened. The royal court kept records of everything, and behind the polished language, a cruel truth slipped through. They described him as more spectre than sovereign, a ghost in a crown, and yet he held the throne. He signed laws with shaking hands, gave orders he barely understood, and was addressed as His Majesty by men who pitied him. The gap between his title and his reality was painful to watch. He ruled over millions, yet couldn't button his own coat. Servants led him through halls he didn't recognize. Priests begged heaven for a miracle that never came. And while the very people who had created him with their obsession for royal purity continued to bow, pretending he was something he had never been fit to rule. The palace grew quieter as Charles aged, not with peace, but with fear. People no longer spoke openly about his condition. Instead, they whispered in corners and behind fans. Rumors spread like fire through silk hallways. Some said he was cursed, that the devil had touched him at birth. Others believed he was possessed, that his strange seizures and hollow stare were signs of something evil inside him. Priests were called in not to comfort him, but to drive out demons. They held long prayers in candlelit rooms, waving incense and chanting over the boy king who barely understood what was happening. Servants claimed they heard him screaming at night, wild, broken cries that didn't sound human. And through it all, the queen sat silent. Mariana, who had once believed her son would save the dynasty, now watched him crumble under its weight. The court didn't blame the years of inbreeding or the kings who had married their nieces. They blamed her womb, her failure to give Spain a strong heir. She wore her guilt like a second crown, heavy and cold, as her son slipped further, away from everything a king was meant to be. Charles was not a single tragedy. He was the final echo of a long, careful disaster. The Habsburg family had spent centuries building an empire, not with war alone, but with marriages that wrapped tighter and tighter around their own blood. First cousins married first cousins. Uncles married their nieces. Some children had fewer grandparents than nature intended because the same people showed up on both sides of the family tree. It wasn't a family anymore. It was a web. Twisted, tangled, inescapable. And with each generation, the same blood was passed down again and again. Like copying the same drawing until the lines began to blur. The consequences were not hidden. Babies were stillborn. Children died before they learned to speak. Those who lived often carried something broken inside, weak lungs, bent spines, soft skulls, minds that never cleared. And Charles, it came crashing down. His jaw, so long it couldn't close properly, was the mark of generations pressing in on him. His seizures, his infertility, his confusion, none of it was new. It was the final result of too many folded lines. Too many. Chances taken with fate. Generation after generation, they folded the same paper. Until it could fold no more, the palace no longer felt like home to her. Its grand halls, once filled with music and ceremony, now echoed with silence and shadows. Mariana, the queen, drifted through the corridors like a ghost herself. She prayed constantly, knees bruised. From hours spent before cold stone altars, lips cracked from endless whispers to heaven. She fasted, hoping her suffering might somehow heal what her son could not. Some nights, she didn't sleep at all. Servants found her standing still in the dark, speaking softly to no one. They said she was talking to the dead. To her mother, to God, to the baby she once believed would save Spain. Her eyes, once proud and sharp, now looked far away, as if fixed on something only she could see. She birthed a king, yes. But the cost had been everything. Her youth, her dreams, her peace. Piece by piece, she had buried her soul under duty, beneath a crown that had never truly belonged to her. When Charles was crowned king, there was no roar of hope, only quiet dread. The boy sat on the throne, dressed in gold and velvet, but his eyes wandered, confused by the ceremony around him. He barely understood what was happening. He couldn't speak clearly, couldn't lead, couldn't command. Ministers stood behind him, whispering decisions into his ear or speaking for him entirely. The real power lay in the hands of those who pulled the strings, advisors, priests, relatives, while Charles sat slouched and blinking, a royal symbol rather than a true ruler. He was expected to continue the bloodline, but his body failed him there too. No children came. No heir. Just long silences, awkward appearances, and the growing weight of a dying dynasty. His reign wasn't marked by glory or conquest, but by absence or rule that never truly was. The throne had a king, yes, but it was only a shadow sitting there, not a leader. When Charles II took his final breath, the silence that followed wasn't just for a man, it was for a dynasty. With no child to carry his name, no brother or cousin untainted by the same blood, the great line of Spanish Habsburgs ended in that quiet room. Centuries of rule, of empires built and defended, collapsed not with war, but with one broken body that had borne too much of the same blood. The crown that once dazzled Europe now sat empty, its legacy shattered not by enemies, but by its own pride. For generations, they believed they were above the world, that their blood was too sacred to share. But each choice, each marriage that turned inward, had brought them closer to this moment. Charles wasn't just the last king of his line. He was the final echo of a house too proud to mix their blood, and too blind to see it was killing them. Centuries later, science finally gave words to what history had whispered all along. The twisted branches of the royal family tree, once praised for keeping the bloodline pure, were revealed to be the source of their greatest suffering. Geneticists traced the damaged generation after generation of shared DNA folding in on itself, compounding flaws, silencing strength, disorders of the jaw, infertility, epilepsy, all born not from curses but from choices. Choices made in candlelit courts not from love but from fear of outsiders. They recycled blood like it was sacred wine, passing the same names, the same faces, the same fragile genes through time. Behind every royal portrait lies a hidden cost eyes too close, limbs too frail, minds that never had a chance. What they saw as power we now understand as a quiet unraveling. The pain was written not just in their stories, but in their cells. In the end, the suffering wasn't fate. It was human, predictable, preventable, tragic. After everything, the queen died as she had lived alone in silence. Her jewels were passed on, her titles forgotten, but the pain she carried never left those stone walls. They found her letters tucked between faded cloth and empty drawers, ink smeared by tears that had dried long ago. In them she wrote not of glory or triumph, but of guilt, of prayers unanswered, of a son she could never save. Charles's image, once hung in gold frames, was quietly taken down, as if removing his face could erase the memory. But it never did. The halls still whispered his name. The shadows still knew his shape. Time moved on. Kings came and went, but the story stayed behind, etched into the marble, carried in the cold of the rooms where he once sat, dressed in velvet, too weak to rule. The palace forgot their names, but it remembered their sorrow. But Spain was only one chapter in a much bigger story. The belief that royal blood must stay untouched didn't die with Charles. It spread like a shadow across centuries and continents. In Austria, the same names appeared again and again cousins. Marrying cousins, each generation a little weaker than the last. In ancient Egypt, brother married sister in golden tombs, their lineage crumbling beneath their crowns. Even in modern Europe, royal houses linked arms in tightly woven webs, their children born not of love, but of duty. Pale faces, sunken eyes, and trembling hands appear in portrait after portrait, dressed in silk but haunted all the same. Each ruler a reflection of a mistake repeated chosen by blood, but cursed by it too. They weren't monsters. They were victims of a system too. Proud to change, too scared to open its doors, and too blind to see what it was becoming. They called him a monster. Whispers filled the palace of curses, of demons, of something unnatural hiding behind royal robes. But he didn't ask to be born. He didn't choose the twisted roots of his family tree or the cold weight of a crown. Placed on his fragile head, he was just a boy tired, broken, and alone made to carry the sins of generations. The real monsters wore silk and smiled in painted portraits. They sat at banquet tables and arranged marriages like chess moves, convinced they were preserving greatness. But what they preserved was pain. It was their pride, their hunger for power, their fear of change that created him, not as a ruler, but as a symbol of everything gone wrong. He was not the curse. He was the proof that the curse was real. And as he struggled to live under a crown too heavy for his shaking hands, the silence of those who made him spoke louder than any scream. And then the silence returned. The queen's belly once more carried hope, or what they dared to call it. A final chance, a final prayer, whispered through the palace halls. A golden cradle was placed near her bed, carved with angels and trimmed with silk, waiting for the cries of a child who might save the crown. But the cries never came. The room stayed quiet. No nurses rushed in. No bells rang. The cradle stood untouched, day after day, until the silk began to dull and the gold gathered dust. It was meant to hold a future, but instead it held the weight of everything lost, no heir, no legacy, just empty silence where life was supposed to begin. And in that silence, the truth lingered. Some bloodlines do not end with a bang, but with a breath that never arrives. They say the palace is quiet now, just stone and memory. But some who walk its halls still pause when the air shifts, when the candles flicker for no reason. They whisper of footsteps, soft, uneven, like someone dragging one foot behind the other. A boy steps. Some claim they've seen a shadow in royal silk pass by the mirrors, never reflected. Others speak of faint crying behind doors long sealed shut. It's always the same story. A limping child, silent and alone, trailing fabric too fine for the living. They say it's just old wind, just imagination. But deep down, no one truly believes the palace was ever emptied. Some burdens are, too, heavy to die with their owners. Some stories don't end, even after the bloodline does. And so we're left to wonder, was it worth it? The titles, the jewels, the endless ceremonies, the centuries of power built on silence, fear, and sacrifice. A mother's pain traded for a throne, a child born only to suffer, a kingdom ruled by ghosts, a chased purity and found ruin. They guarded their bloodline so tightly that it choked itself. And in the end, what did they really hold? A crown polished with generations of grief, balanced on a skull too fragile to carry the weight. The palaces still stand, the portraits still hang, but the price of their pride echoes louder than anthem. Blood doesn't lie. No matter how much gold they wore or how many titles they carried, the truth seeped through their skin. You can see it now painted smiles that don't quite meet the eyes, faces too long or too small, eyes sunken behind royal pride. As old portraits fade into medical diagrams, the silence speaks louder than any royal decree. These weren't just kings and queens, they were evidence. Living proof of what happens when power is protected more fiercely than people. Generation after generation, their blood whispered what no one dared to say aloud. That nature cannot be fooled. That the body remembers what the throne tries to forget. And in the end, it's the blood that tells the story no crown can hide. And so the story comes to an end not with a grand coronation or kingdom saved, but with silence echoing through empty halls. She was the queen who birthed the monster, they said. But they never looked close enough to see the truth. The real horror wasn't in the child who struggled to walk, or in the twisted body wrapped in velvet. It was in the crown that demanded he exist, in the blood that was kept pure at the cost of health, happiness, and humanity, in the rules that forbade love but worshipped lineage. Behind every royal portrait was a story written in pain, whispered, through locked doors and sealed letters. A throne built not on greatness, but on bones. And in the end, it wasn't just one family that suffered. It was generations, cursed not by magic, but by the choices of those too proud to change.